Please be seated. We're back on record with the parties present. Are parties ready to proceed? Yes. I see Ms. Harrison and Mr. Flynn on Zoom, but I saw Ms. Harrison wave via Zoom, and she's probably going to go back off. She's not participating at this point.
I'm in the waiting room just for purposes of video sharing.
Nothing like finding out your volume was not on. Please make sure to like and share this video. This is one event that you definitely want to be a part of. Make sure everybody in Alaska is well informed on what's going on with the Kowalke again versus Eastman case that we're about ready to hear. Part 2 for today. This is going to be going on all week long. I just received word my plow truck is on the way, so I will be in the courtroom tomorrow streaming this live from there instead of restreaming it out to all of you here in my shop. Again, take a moment, like, share this video, go to all the different channels out there, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Rumble. Like and subscribe to us. Make sure one of the most important ones to subscribe to at this moment in time is YouTube, and making sure that you have hit that notification bell. They are the only ones that are making sure that the live streams are going out and notifying you that it has happened. Also need subscribers on Rumble, so I can make that happen there too. As soon as I reach 100, I will be able to live stream directly to them, and they are very good about giving out notifications if you have subscribed and selected the one to be notified. Thank you guys again for all tuning in here today. Like, share, and they are beginning.
Did you have a good day?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so before we went on break, I was asking about the Jericho March and some statements that Mr. Rhodes made at that march, and I wanted to play a video for you now.
Okay.
So I guess I'll hit share screen.
Is this Exhibit 45?
Yes. May not be able to. I'm not sure why my computer's not letting me do it. Hold on. One more time and then we can move on. Your Honor, it's not letting me.
Is it a problem with the screen share, or is it a...
It's requiring me to give a permission that when I try to do it, when I try to grant the permission, it's not allowing me. We can move on. I'll try to figure it out. We can cover it with the witness tomorrow. All right, sorry about that, everyone. Mr. Lewis, before the break, we were talking about the November 9 GoToMeeting or virtual meeting that was held by the GoToMeeting app. Were there other meetings held with that app to coordinate activities by the Oath Keepers?
To the best of my knowledge, the group had used that app several times throughout the course of fall 2020. However, I do not believe a full accounting of that app's usage has been made public at present.
All right, and if you can go to Exhibit 25, paragraph 13 in the Joshua James Statement of Offense.
Yes.
Does that reference another instance in which the GoToMeeting app was used for coordination purposes?
Yes, it references meetings, an unspecified number, which were held in December 2020 and January 2021, which were invitation-only meetings organized, quote, to facilitate planning for the event of January 6th in and around Washington, D.C.
All right, thank you. So if we could move forward now to the time period right around January 6th of 2021. And can you start by telling us whether travel plans were coordinated by the Oath Keepers for that trip?
Yes, they were, both at the national level by Stewart Rhodes, as well as specific chapter-based plans were put into place well before January 6th. At the aftermath of that December 12 Jericho March and the related Million MAGA March rally that had taken place in DC, members of the Oath Keepers began to organize plans to travel to DC for the events of January 6th. You had individuals in North Carolina, for example, who discussed renting a bus to bring 40 plus members of their group up to DC. You had individuals who were planning on largely driving due to their concerns around flying, of course, with firearms. So many of them, such as Stewart Rhodes, chose to drive to the district. And so what you saw was largely regional planning by Oath Keepers in Ohio, in Georgia, in Florida, and North Carolina, who began to make travel and lodging arrangements in and around Washington, D.C. for January 5th, 6th, and 7th, largely.
And what kind of lodging arrangements were made?
Hotels. So you had individuals in several hotels in Washington, D.C., to the best of my recollection, and namely a Comfort Inn hotel in Boston, which served as the meeting point for the Quick Reaction Force in Boston, which is a suburb of Arlington, Virginia. And so that location was chosen, and several rooms were rented in that Virginia hotel. Stewart Rhodes also booked several rooms in one of the nearby District of Columbia hotels for the purposes of serving as kind of a meeting place and war room for his members on the eve of January 6th.
And when you say a District of Columbia hotel, were these hotels in the district or were they outside the district?
Yes, so the majority of Oath Keepers were staying inside the District of Columbia. However, the ones who were part of that Quick Reaction Force, the QRF, had found lodging in Virginia, in Arlington, due explicitly to the District of Columbia's gun laws and concerns that the Oath Keepers would be arrested if they were to bring their firearms into the district. So they planned to and carried out plans to station and store those firearms in a number of adjoining hotel rooms in this Comfort Inn in Boston.
Are you generally familiar with the activities of the Oath Keepers who were charged, say from January 4 to 6 of 2021?
Yes, sir.
And where does your knowledge about those activities come from?
A variety of sources, namely the charging documents that we've discussed here today, as well as the plea agreements, statements of offense, evidence introduced at trial, as well as public records, including video and audio footage that has been obtained from both open source recordings of the Oath Keepers' activities on January 6th, from Zello recordings of their walkie-talkie communications that they had used on January 6th, and related methods such as that.
Right. So, from your understanding and review of those sources, when did the Oath Keepers begin arriving in the DC area?
Most began to arrive on January 5th, and most checked in the afternoon or evening of January 5th. Many of them had planned to serve as a security detail for rally VIPs, including and most pertinently Roger Stone. And so many of them had traveled under the auspices of being part of that security detail for the Stop the Steal rally VIPs, who ultimately were at the Ellipse on January 6th. And so near all the Oath Keepers, to my knowledge, were already in the District of Columbia by the time we get to the morning of January 6th.
And what did the Oath Keepers bring with them to Washington?
As Stuart Rhodes instructed them to, many of them brought firearms with them. Stuart Rhodes himself brought and purchased numerous, whether it's a shotgun, night vision goggles, a scope, other firearms attachments. Several other Oath Keepers were recorded bringing long rifles and other firearms with them to the DC area and ultimately depositing those at that Ballston hotel we just discussed.
And were any additional weapons purchased en route?
Yeah, by Stuart Rhodes, yes. So Stuart Rhodes spent upwards of $20,000, according to evidence introduced by the government, on a variety of firearms and firearms components, including, to the best of my recollection, scopes, other firearms attachments, at least one additional shotgun, and related firearms components.
Now turning to the morning of January 6th, can you give us kind of a rundown of what happened starting in the morning?
Absolutely. So the Oath Keepers, who were part of specific security details, arrived at the area hotels where the VIPs were staying, namely Roger Stone. The Oath Keepers, who were not part of specific security details, much like the rest of the rally attendees, slowly trickled in to the area of the Ellipse on the morning of January 6th to begin to listen to the various speeches that were going on that morning.
Do we know which of the Oath Keepers who've been charged were part of a security detail and which ones were not?
Yes. So the individuals who were part of Stack 2, which included Brian Ulrich, who has subsequently pleaded guilty to seditious conspiracy. The individuals who were with him, who I can refresh their names if I can reference the report quickly. But the individuals who were part of Stack 2 were the ones who had provided security, had returned to their hotel at the conclusion of the rally, where their security detail effectively ended, who then saw the events happening, checking their phones, and then who returned to the Capitol on golf carts.
And do you recall how many people were in Stack 2?
I believe 4 individuals were charged, although a 5th individual was charged separately and a 6th individual was an unindicted co-conspirator. So I believe that would bring the total to 6, 4 of whom have been charged federally and 1 of whom has pleaded guilty.
And other than the individuals in Stack 2, were the other Oath Keepers not part of any security detail?
To the best of my knowledge, they were not. They had roles and they were given some form of access to the VIP area, but to my understanding, they did not have specific security arrangements that day. Although again, that's not something that's been expounded on in detail in the public record.
Right. And how were these Oath Keepers communicating with each other on the 6th?
Primarily through Signal. In many of the same chats that we discussed earlier, there were several chats designed for the individuals who were physically present that day. So just as we saw in one of the earlier quotes that we had gone over, there was that December 12th DC op for the individuals who were going to DC for the Jericho March. There was a specific channel or a specific signal group that was created for the Oath Keepers who would be on the ground, where Rhodes could issue orders to them, and Rhodes was also used the leadership intel chat that we discussed as one of his other primary means of communication.
And how would you describe the level of activity on those chats on January 6th?
Very, very frequent. There were a lot of posts going back and forth from individuals both on the ground and also individuals who were passing on information to the individuals present who were watching the events on TV. There were numerous conversations going on as that crowd started trickling from the ellipse onto restricted Capitol grounds and ultimately over the bike racks, over the barricades, up the steps of the Capitol, and ultimately as they began making their breaches of the Capitol building at around 2:00 that afternoon. The level of activity in those chats increased significantly as information began flowing in and Rhodes began communicating orders to his subordinates.
Besides the signal chats, were they communicating by any other means?
There were ongoing communications that utilized that push to talk walkie-talkie app known as Zello. That is information that was introduced very early on in the investigation proceeding against the Oath Keepers, and that's something that was used both by individuals who were present that day and individuals who were Oath Keepers who were not present inside the Capitol itself. And so that was designed to get around what they expected accurately to be relatively poor cell coverage on Capitol grounds that day.
And despite that poor cell coverage, were there instances of also telephone communications?
Yes, there were several key phone calls that were made that illustrate Rhodes's command and control of his group throughout the day of January 6th. Namely, and I think most pertinently, not to jump ahead too far, but right before you have the breach of the rotunda doors by Stack 1, the main contingent of Oath Keepers led by Kelly Meggs, you have a phone call between Stuart Rhodes, Michael Green, his operations leader, and then a conferencing in of Kelly Meggs in a phone call that lasts for, I believe, about 1.5 to 2 minutes. And that was, maybe 2 minutes before Kelly Meggs leads the stack up the Capitol. And so I think that does speak to pretty significantly the level of command and control that Rhodes had over his subordinates and the members of the conspiracy on that day.
Now let's back up a little bit and have you explain what time did the Oath Keepers first begin arriving at the Capitol building?
Sure. So Oath Keepers began trickling onto Capitol grounds along with masses of this mob around 1:30, 1:45 p.m. At that point, signal messages began to be exchanged between Rhodes and individuals who were perhaps watching the coverage on TV. There were several comments made by those viewers that Antifa is breaching the Capitol building, to which Rhodes replies, in effect, "I'm here. I see what's going on. This is not Antifa. These are pissed off patriots." And the pissed off patriots is an exact quote from Rhodes' signal messages there. And so Rhodes is in real time seeing the breaches of the Capitol happening by elements of the Proud Boys and other rioters as it's going on. And he's relaying that information to his leadership intel chat, to his subordinates, keeping them up to date on what's going on.
And meanwhile, what was happening inside the Capitol building?
So that's where you have really that very first breach, right? That now infamous photo of Proud Boy Dominic Pizzola using the captured riot shield to smash the side window of the U.S. Capitol and then open the emergency exit door immediately to the left of that window, which allowed rioters to begin pouring in faster and faster. And at that point, they begin overwhelming the thin line of Capitol Police who are stationed in that area and moving deeper into the Capitol. And that's where you get many of the famous images that I think we're all largely familiar with, where you have individuals like the QAnon shaman Jacob Chansley confronting Capitol Police members, QAnon adherents like Doug Jensen, who chases a Capitol Police officer up the steps with a knife, and similar activities as this first breach is taking place. And again, it's important to note that Stewart Rhodes is not 2 miles away, unclear of what's going on. He is, by this point, on Capitol grounds, within earshot, within eyeshot of these breaches taking place. And what's important to make clear is he recognizes this opportunity. He sees what's happening. He takes note that these are patriots, that they have a common enemy, that these individuals who are here, even if they're not all oath keepers, they share his goals on that day. They want to use force to stop the electoral certification. And so he sees this opportunity and begins communicating with the Oath Keepers members who are with him that day. And so he sends a message to them saying, anyone who's available, anyone who's not actively providing security needs to come. I believe he says come to the south side, although he was mistaken of his directions at the Capitol, and he was actually standing on the east side when he sent that message. And so that's right around 2:15 as individuals from the Oath Keepers begin assembling at the bottom of the steps of the east side of the Capitol, about 20 minutes before the phone call we discussed with Kelly Meggs and Michael Simmons, and about 25 minutes before Kelly Meggs leads Stack 1 up the steps in that photo we've seen of the Oath Keepers in their attire, in the Oath Keepers apparel, with their helmets and armor on, one on the back of the individual in front of them, moving up those East Rotunda steps in unison there.
Now, when these breaches were occurring, was there any kind of official proceeding happening inside the Capitol?
Yes, at the time of the first breach, Congress was still in session. Vice President Pence was proceeding over the certification of the electoral results, and it was not for some time later when the session had to be stopped due to the violent breach of the Capitol by the rioters.
Now, you mentioned that some of the Oath Keepers on the private chats were asking about Antifa. Was Rhodes expecting a large contingent of Antifa to be in Washington on that day?
That was certainly one of his many varied conspiracies that he expected. Again, if we kind of roll this all the way back to that October 27 Alex Jones podcast interview, right? He's discussing 20,000 Antifa members who are supposedly going to scale the fences of the White House on Election Day. He was consistently perturbed by this specter of a threat by Antifa. And so many of his comments publicly and privately alluded to the fact that they wouldn't just be fighting the government on January 6th, they'd be fighting Antifa, which again, he kind of viewed as a catch-all term for anyone who disagreed with the right-wing conspiracies that he embraced. If it wasn't Antifa, it was BLM. If it wasn't Black Lives Matter, it was the Bureau of Land Management. He really just wanted to create a boogeyman out of whatever outgroup, whatever enemy was most expeditious to his group achieving their goal at that time.
And did his expectation of a large Antifa contingent materialize on that day?
It did not, no sir.
And you referenced some comments that Rhodes made as the breaches were occurring. If I can have you look at Exhibit 23, paragraph 28.
Yep.
Paragraph
28. Is that what you were referring to earlier?
Yes. So there you have right before 11:30, you have someone who messages and says that he thinks the Antifa is breaching the Capitol, to which Rhodes replied, and I'm quoting here, "Nope, I'm right here. These are patriots."
And did any of the other individuals, oath keepers who pleaded guilty, make the same kind of, or recall the same comment from Rhodes about the people being patriots?
Yes. Yes, I believe several of the other ones made similar claims around those comments, that these are pissed off patriots, that they are acting in the vision of the founding fathers, and that this is our Lexington and Concord, effectively.
And for example, if you go to Exhibit 27, paragraph 32.
Yes.
The one we just talked about was from the Wilson statement of offense. This one is in the Ulrich statement of offense. And did he report the same chat, same comments from Rhodes about the individuals breaching the Capitol being patriots and not Antifa?
Yes.
And at some point, did Rhodes give an update to the Oath Keepers about the status of what was happening in the certification proceedings?
Yes. He told them that Pence is doing nothing, that Trump is complaining, as paragraph 32 in the Ulrich statement of offense, their notes. He says that, quote, the patriots taking it into their own hands, they've had enough. This is, again, a continuation of his comments there, that there is no political solution, that the politicians have failed them, that Pence has failed them, that Trump has not invoked, and so they have to take matters into their own hands.
And did the Oath Keepers who were there actually take the matters into their own hands?
They did, yes. When you examine the movements of the Oath Keepers, the activities of the Oath Keepers, Stack 1 engaged in a forceful breach of the East Rotunda doors and was part of that violent mob that forced their way into the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, who pushed back on overwhelmed Capitol police officers, and who were part of the broader mob, which ultimately was successful in delaying the certification.
And the Oath Keepers who were, well, let me back up. So when the breach of the Capitol started, do you have an estimate of how many Oath Keepers were actually at the Capitol building at that time?
I believe of the 24 or so who have been charged as part of that conspiracy, evidence has shown that probably 20 of them were on restricted Capitol grounds or in the immediate vicinity of the Capitol. You have Stack 2, which returned to their hotel only to come back after they realized what's going on. And it's also worth just pointing out that there were a indeterminate number of Oath Keepers, including a not insignificant number from North Carolina, who had traveled to DC, who were part of the individuals on Capitol grounds, but because of charging decisions by the DOJ, have not been prosecuted. And so that certainly adds a not insignificant number of Oath Keepers to that final tally.
If I'm understanding you correctly, when the breaches started, there were some number of Oath Keepers that were already at the Capitol, and then additional Oath Keepers arrived on scene. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So at the time of the first breaches by rioters, prior to this 2:30 time frame we're discussing here, many of the Oath Keepers were either already on restricted Capitol grounds, so that is the Capitol lawn directly west and east of the Capitol, or they were still trickling over from the rally itself. And as you noted, there were several who had gone back to their hotel. I believe it was the Mayflower Hotel where they had been staying, who then saw what was happening, began having phone calls with purportedly other Oath Keepers, and then realized that they had to go back to the Capitol to participate in the breach.
And can you describe what these Oath Keepers were wearing when they entered the Capitol building?
Yes, they were to a T, all nearly wearing the same attire, which was Oath Keepers apparel with some form of protective equipment, whether it was a helmet or knee pads or some kind of protective plate, but all prominently displaying Oath Keepers attire as they moved up into the Capitol and used force to breach it.
Can you explain what a protective plate is?
Yes, so several of them had been wearing, I don't know if they were actually bulletproof vests or some other kind of plate carrier designed to protect themselves from projectiles effectively.
And would it have been apparent to someone on the scene that these were Oath Keepers?
Yes, due to the sight of them, especially as they moved up the steps of the Capitol in unison in that very military style stack formation, as they were all wearing nearly the exact same outfits. It certainly would have stood out from the average member of the crowd who was likely wearing a QAnon shirt or some sort of MAGA apparel and maybe a pair of jeans. They certainly would have stood out to your average attendee.
And you mentioned now a few times the stack formation. Can you describe what that is?
Yes. So as stack one, which included Kelly Meggs, Connie Meggs, Jessica Watkins, about I want to say eight to 10 total Oath Keepers began to move up the steps of the Capitol, up those east side rotunda steps. They're obviously in this massive throng of individuals who are all trying to push into the Capitol itself violently. And so the way they operated moving up those steps in order to remain together, to remain a cohesive unit, was to move up in what in military jargon, again, is a stack formation with one individual, holding the, whether it's the backpack or the shoulder of the person directly in front of them in order to not be separated in this massive crowd.
Did any of the Oath Keepers admit to using force when they were inside the building?
Yes.
Which ones?
Joshua James and William Wilson, in their pleading, both admitted that they used force in furtherance of their goals on that day, which in pleading admitted was to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power.
When you say pleadings, are you referring to the statements of offense that they signed?
Yes.
Did the two stacks or either of the stacks make it inside the rotunda?
Yes. So they arrived at different times. So stack one entered first and successfully breached the Capitol building and was inside the rotunda. Stack two entered approximately half an hour later and was also successful in temporarily breaching the rotunda. Stack one, due to the timing, due to the size of the crowd and the mob around them, was more successful in their breach attempts and were able to actually, at least some of them, once they were inside the rotunda, they had effectively found themselves without any police line immediately in front of them. And so they were able to move deeper into the Capitol building itself.
And were they looking for anyone in particular inside the Capitol?
Yes, they were searching for Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House. And I think that is an important point because it comports pretty cleanly with their comments around the use of force, the use of violence, this painting of Congress specifically as a target for their attempts to overthrow the U.S. government. And the individual who at that time was the Speaker of the House is certainly demonstrates their intent on that day to use force to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power.
Did any of the Oath Keepers admit to having altercations with the Capitol Police?
Yes, to my recollection, both Joshua James and William Wilson's statements of offense reference that they had used force inside the Capitol building in furtherance of their conspiracy.
So you mentioned Wilson. If you look at Exhibit 23, paragraph 39.
Yes.
that one of the admissions that you're referring to?
Yes, it specifies, and quoting, that Wilson intended to use force and did in fact use force in the Capitol in order to prevent, hinder, and delay the execution of the laws governing the transfer of power. And that's, again, a direct quote from his statement of offense, to which he pleaded guilty to almost immediately upon being charged.
And then in paragraph 40 of the same statement, it talks about the intimidation and coercion of government personnel. Is that also what you were referring to?
Yes, where in that second line where it says, quote, he accomplished this by intimidating and coercing government personnel who were participating in or supporting the congressional proceeding, including members of Congress, congressional staff, and law enforcement officers with the Capitol Police.
In your assessment, were the Oath Keepers who participated in the January 6th insurrection acting rogue or under the auspices of the organization?
They were wholeheartedly operating within the auspices of the organization. They were acting at the behest of, at the direction of Stewart Rhodes. They were taking orders from Stewart Rhodes. Stewart Rhodes brought them to the U.S. Capitol with the intended purpose of conspiring to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power, and at the end of that conspiracy would have been the overthrow of the U.S. government. And so every Oath Keeper who engaged in this conspiracy did so knowingly, did so willingly, and did so at the direction of Stewart Rhodes, who leveraged his position as lifetime chairman of the board, founder, and president of the Oath Keepers to do so.
Prior to January 6th, are you aware of any instances where, like, an individual Oath Keepers person or chapter engaged in operations that did not have the approval of leadership?
There were several local mobilization efforts by Oath Keepers, although none which were done without Stewart Rhodes' knowledge.
Are you aware of any instances where Rhodes rebuked individual Oath Keepers for lack of a better word, going rogue?
No.
Based on the evidence that you reviewed, is there any evidence that Antifa played a major role in the events of January 6th?
No, there is no evidence to suggest that Antifa played any role in the events of January 6th.
Is there any evidence that the January 6th events were either staged or incited by the FBI?
No, there is absolutely no evidence to support that assertion.
Is there any evidence that the events were staged or incited by the Capitol Police?
No.
Is it reasonable to conclude that the events of January 6th were just a peaceful protest?
It is not. The data, the information clearly shows that hundreds of individuals have been charged with assaulting or impeding law enforcement. More than 100 have been charged with committing acts of violence with the intent to cause bodily injury or harm to members of law enforcement. And so it certainly does not comport with reality to suggest that the events of January 6th at the U.S. Capitol were in any way a peaceful protest.
Now, what time did the Oath Keepers and just the mob at large who was at the Capitol begin to disperse?
Sure. So each stack was ultimately pushed out of the Capitol by 4 o'clock, more or less. Some individuals had trickled out earlier than that, but most of them had left by that point in the face of a robust law enforcement response that had begun operations to clear the building, especially the sections where the Oath Keepers were in the rotunda was quickly recovered by law enforcement after the Oath Keepers had entered. And so by around 4 o'clock, 4:30, they had all largely been pushed out or left the Capitol building in the face of law enforcement response.
And at this point, did Rhodes tell the Oath Keepers to leave Washington and give up their plans?
He did not. He told the members of the Oath Keepers to assemble on the edge of Capitol grounds near the Supreme Court, where he had taken up a position. They had rallied and regrouped, and then shortly after that, the bulk of the Oath Keepers who were at the Capitol followed Rhodes to, I believe it was the Phoenix Hotel, where Rhodes had booked a suite for that night.
And if you can look at Exhibit 23, paragraph 44.
Yes.
Is that what you're referring to about the suite at the hotel?
It is, yes. That section specifies that Rhodes gathered Wilson and other Oath Keepers inside of his private suite, and then he called an individual who's not named, but who is represented as an intermediary between Rhodes and President Trump. And as paragraph 44 there lays out in quite sufficient detail, Rhodes heard, quote, or Wilson heard, quote, Rhodes repeatedly implored the individual to tell President Trump to call upon groups like the Oath Keepers to forcibly oppose the transfer of power. The individual denied Rhodes' request to speak directly with President Trump. After the call ended, Rhodes stated to the group, quote, "I just want to fight," quote.
And after the meeting at the hotel, did the group reconvene somewhere else?
They did, yes. The group, which included Stuart Rhodes, William Wilson, Kelly Sorrell, and other co-conspirators, met at an Olive Garden in Vienna, Virginia.
So if you look at paragraph 47 of the same exhibit, it talks about a meeting at a restaurant that's not named in the statement. Is that what you're referring to?
It is, yes.
And what was discussed during that meeting?
As paragraph 47 details, Rhodes continued to lay out his assessment that there was a need to fight against the government and that this was akin to the American Revolutionary War. And it's at that point, as that next paragraph there details, that Rhodes begun to believe that law enforcement was searching for him in order to arrest him. And then he took measures to avoid law enforcement detection, which, as the middle of paragraph 48 there shows, he discussed deleting incriminating information off their cell phones. And then at the bottom of that paragraph, it details that he intentionally left his mobile phone with one person and departed with another person in their car. And again, this is, as that paragraph details, because Rhodes was under the impression that he was about to be arrested. Again, because Rhodes recognized that they had just forcefully, illegally breached the U.S. Capitol building in an attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power and overthrow the U.S. government, and recognized that there would be this impending law enforcement response that he feared would target his group.
Did Rhodes have a legal background?
Yes, he was a graduate of Yale Law School.
And to your knowledge, had he ever practiced law?
He did practice law in Montana before being disbarred.
And have you seen any other evidence that Rhodes became aware after the events of January 6th that the actions of the Oath Keepers may have crossed the line into illegal conduct?
Yes. In the aftermath of January 6th, Rhodes and his co-conspirators took further steps to attempt to either downplay their actions or hide evidence of their actions. In fact, the general counsel of the group, Kelly Sorrell, who is the individual referenced in in that paragraph 48 around the quote, one of the co-conspirators, was later charged because she was tampering with evidence and telling the Oath Keepers to begin to delete incriminating evidence of what they had just done off of their cell phones.
Earlier, you had testified about two open letters that Rhodes posted on the website. Was there another open letter that Rhodes sent to membership?
Yes.